Okay, so I want these buttons to look like spaces instead of buttons, and a lot of the problem is the text. I'm just gonna, first I'm gonna actually create a prefab of one of the buttons. And if you're not sure what a prefab is basically a copy of, a game object. So I can drag this into my prefabs folder. I could drag it in any folder. I specifically choose in my prefabs folder. But this will create a prefab, and because it's a copy, I can reuse this copy. So I'm going to delete these buttons because those are not part of the prefab. And then I can just duplicate this 8 times. And now I have 9 versions of the same button. And if I make a change to one, it makes a change to all of them, which is why we want it to be a prefab. So I'm going to make a change to the text of this object and make sure that it's blank. And then I'll go back to the outer button. I'll click on this overrides. And you can see it tells me what I did. If I click on this text, you can see I changed it from button to no button. And that's what I want to apply. But in this case, you can also just say apply all. The reason why they do it this way is in case you only want to apply part of what you did, which I could do here. But I'm just going to apply all. Okay, so I applied all, and you can see all of the buttons changed. They all now have a text object that has nothing in it. Just in case you don't see everything change, which can happen, that happens because your buttons need to, well, let me make a quick change actually so you can see what I mean. Let me change this color. Okay, so this is the only button that has that color changed right now. So sometimes when you make a change and you hit apply all, it only appears in the object you're currently using, and that's because the other buttons already have a separate change, and so they're not sure whether to apply or not apply the conflicting change. So a way to fix that is if you know for sure you want this change, you can revert all, and it will just basically go back to whatever the prefab has, and that happens to be a white square in this case. So anyways, so now I've got my buttons that are blank, and they get nicely placed at the start of the scene. So some things I want to add, I want to make sure each button has this button script, this board button script. And then now let's start editing that script. Let's start creating that board button script. So I'm going to go back into here to board button, and I'm just going to get rid of this for now. We'll add it back later if we need it. And the first thing I want is a status. And this will be either 0, 1, or 2. 0 means O, fitting because they both kind of look the same. 1 means X, and then 2 means empty. So no one has selected it, so it's still open. So that's all we need for statuses. We need either X, O, or empty. And each button is going to know its own status. That's why I have this script. And I need this to be public because this information will need to get accessed by my Tic-Tac-Toe tutorial script. This is basically a manager of all these buttons. So this information needs to be public, but I don't want it to show up in the editor because I don't want the user to be able to edit this. Or sorry, not the user, the developer to edit this. So I'll just say hi, inspector. And now it can be public, but it also won't show up in the inspector. Okay, I'm also going to need a button, and the button is basically the UI object that is attached to this script. But you can see button didn't pop up and it wouldn't let me type that, and that's once again because I am not using UI. So I need a public button, and I'm just going to call it button. It's just the button attached, or that's on the same object as the script. And I want a private object text, and I'm just going to call it text. And this is the text inside the button. And we're just going to change this text to X, O, or empty based on the status. Okay, I don't want the user to be able to put a button in here because we're going to end up assigning the button through script. So there's no point for this to show up in the editor either. Okay, so now I'm going to start this script, and we actually do need start. So I'm going to retype that. I think by default actually start is usually private. It doesn't really matter, but so we're just going to start off with every button having a status of 2 because they should be empty. So that's pretty simple. We also in start need to make sure our button is correctly connected to the button component. So we're just going to say get component button, and because I didn't put anything before get component, it's going to assume it means this, and this is this script. So it's going to look for a button attached to the same object as this script. I could say, if I had a separate game object, other dot get component, if other is a game object, and that would look for this component on that other object. Text, we're going to do something very similar, but the text won't actually be on the button, it'll be a child of the button, because the text object is a child of the button. So that's why we're saying get component and children. And I'll quickly show you what I mean. So here's one of our standard buttons. If I open it up, you'll see the text object is a child of it. This is when you create a UI button, that's pretty much standard how it works, is to have the text object under it. So. Okay, so now everything is set up correctly. Let's just make sure that that text is also blank. Cool. So now we're going to write the function that happens when this button is pressed, this specific button. So I'm just going to call it onPressButton. Let's see. We need to get the image object attached to the button so we can change the color. That's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm going to call it sprite. Image. Oops. There we go. And then before I go any further, the other piece of information we need to know is whose turn it is when we press this button, and we don't have a way to do that yet. So I'm going to go back to Tic-Tac-Toe, and I'm going to add another variable, and this will be public because we are going to need to access this. And it's going to be an int, and it's going to be current player. And this number should be either 0 for O, 1 for X, and 2 for empty. So that's how we know. Actually, it will never be 2. There is no empty player. So it's either a 0 or a 1. That's how we know which player it is. And then by default in start, I'm going to make sure the current player is 0, so O. You could also randomize this. I could say Unity engine dot random dot range or random range. I don't want this to be a float. There's two choices. If you want it to be an int, just make sure that the inputs to the function are ints. If you give it floats, it'll pick a float number between those two values. So I want it to be between 0 and 1. So now, actually I don't need to say Unity Engine because I'm not using system, which I'll show you real quick. If you're using system, system also has a random, and you're going to get this error because it's not sure if it's the system's random or the Unity Engine's random. But since I'm not using system, I don't need to put that Unity Engine in front. Oh, it turns out random range is obsolete, and instead let's just use range. Should be the same thing though. Yeah, cool. Okay, so this will randomly choose player 1 or player 0. If you want it to be truly random, you actually have to change the seed. So Unity uses kind of a pseudo-random algorithm for random.range, where you'll notice that when you play it enough times, it actually won't be random. And so to fix that, you need to make sure you change the seed, the random seed. So random.init state, this is how you change the seed, and then normally it takes in a seed for what state you want. Well, since we want it to be random and not a specific seed, we're just going to give this seed a very random number. And generally, if you want to get a very random seed, you can just use datetime, which in this case I need system, which means I need to fix this real quick too, and fix this. There you go. And then I would use datetime dot now dot dot milliseconds, or actually I don't think it's a function. Yeah, there you go. So this is just a very long, very unlikely number to reoccur each time you play, obviously because the milliseconds are changing. And so if you use this for an init state, you're pretty much going to get a random value every time. So that's how you make it truly random. Okay. So now I'll get a random start person, and if I go back to board button, the reason we went to Tic-Tac-Toe was to know whose turn it is. So that's what we have as current player. So we're going to grab that information because we want to know the player. So I'm just saying equals, and then this is where we're going to use that instance. So because we made a singleton of Tic-Tac-Toe tutorial, I can call the name of the script, or the name of the class, and I can say instance, and it knows what that is because it's a global variable. And then now with that instance I can grab the current player. And so this is basically how you would grab a variable from a global object, or a tic-tac-toe object, singleton. So now we know which player's turn it is. I'm going to do a switch, and if you're not sure what a switch is, it's basically a way to create a bunch of cases. You could think of it like a bunch of if statements, is another way to think of it. Case 0, so this is the case where the player's turn is O, so it's O's turn. So I'm going to set the sprite.color to, I'm going to have O be green. This is a place where you could, add some creativity. You can choose whatever color you want. You can let the players choose what color they want. This is just a nice place to help customize stuff. I'm going to set the text to O, oops, capital O, and I want to set the status of this button to 0. And I want to make sure the button is no longer interactable. And this will just make it so they can't click it twice, which they shouldn't be able to because you can't take someone else's square or reuse a square. So, and then break. And when you use case, you need to break after each case so that it doesn't overflow into the next case or so. Because if I don't have this break and I'm creating another case, what's going to happen is if it goes into 0, or if case 0 happens, in this case, case 0, if I don't have that break and I have a case 1, it will overflow into case 1 even if that case isn't true. So you need that break. And then we'll do case 1, and we'll do something very similar, except I want to choose a different color. I'll do blue, text, I want it to be X, status is 1, 1 is for X, and then once again we want to make sure the button is not interactable, and we're going to break again. And then you can also have a default case where for some reason the value is different from 0 or 1. This should never happen in our case, but just in case, I'm just going to make sure it treats it like the 0 case or the O case. But this should never happen. So, and then that's it so far for press button. At this point, we would want to switch turns and check to see if anyone won. So we're going to start writing that part. So we're going to go back to Tic-Tac-Toe toot. Well, actually, let's just test this real quick and see if it works. So on this button, I'm going to add something to this onClick method. So I'll hit the plus. I'll drag in itself because it has its board button script. I'll go down to the board button toot function or script, and here's our press button function. And now I want to make sure that's applied to all of these buttons or prefabs. So I'll hit apply, and you'll notice that each one respectively has used itself as the script and with the same function. So I'll hit play, and I'll click on a button, and you can see that O, it's always O because we never switch turns, but you can see it's working. Something else I want to do, because that O is super small, is I want to make the font larger. You could change the font size if you want, but I just want it to be whatever the highest font size it can be is. So I'm just going to set it to 110. So min is 10, max is 100 font size, and then if I hit play, oh, I only changed it on 1, I didn't apply. While we're here, again, let's make sure I want this font style to be bold as well. So if I go back up to this button and I hit apply all, and then now let's try it, we get that nice big O. Okay, so that works. Let's go back to Tic-Tac-Toe tutorial. And the next thing we're going to want to do is make sure we're switching turns. So I'm going to create a new function here. And I want it to be public in this case because I'm going to want to call this in the button script whenever a button is pressed. So I'm just going to call it switch turns. So all we want to do in this case is just take the current turn, or the current player, and we're going to, if it's 0, make it 1, if it's 1, make it 0. So I'm just going to create a one-liner to do that. If you never use these one-liners or you're not sure how they work, they're not too difficult. Basically, this is just a statement on its own. So if current player equals 0, that's what it's a double equal. If current player equals 0, the question mark is for the if statement. Then I want to return 1 and return 1 to current player. Else, which is the colon, return 0. So this is just a quick way to say return 1, else return 0. Okay. And so if we now call this inBoard button at the end of our switch statement, so this is basically at the end of the press button, if we just call Tic-Tac-Toe dot instance, or sorry, we're not trying to do that, we're trying to call switch turns. And if we go back now, and we hit play, once it finishes loading, it should switch to X. There you go. So we've got a semi-functioning tic-tac-toe game going now. The only thing is there's no win scenarios. So we need to set that up. And it also doesn't restart. So we'll do that next.